Hey there, my environmental science students, and welcome to your next set of notes, Investigating Change in Life Over Time. This should be very familiar. This was covered in some detail in your biology classes, so hopefully this sounds really familiar, and hopefully this goes quickly. Please make sure that you not only get the things down that are on the slides, but that you also listen to what I have to say, because I will be explaining this in context, so that way on your upcoming quizzes and tests you do well. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here is your first set of notes. You need to understand what evolution is. It's a change in a population's gene pool over time. A population is the members of a species that all live in the same area. So it's a subset of a species. If you've got like raccoons, the raccoon family that's over here in this one forest is a population. The same species of raccoon in another forest is another population. All right, here is the key. Individuals have adaptations. Populations go through evolution. Okay, so individuals cannot evolve. It is a population, and then it's over time, so it doesn't happen immediately. It is in some cases quick. It just depends on the organism, and in other cases it takes a long time. There are 4 ways that evolution takes place: mutations, migration, genetic drift, and natural selection. So you are familiar with natural selection, but we're going to go ahead and talk about the other ones. All right, mutation is an accidental change in DNA. It results in genetic variation among individuals. Do keep in mind that not all mutations are good. Cancer is a mutation, as an example, and it's not great. It's not beneficial, which means it's not helpful, since some cancers are fatal, and it's not heritable. That means you can't pass it along. So in order for a mutation to be a source of evolution, it is going to have to be something that is beneficial, and then something that can get passed down from generation to generation. So this is just random chance. And honestly, mutations are the foundation for the other types of evolution. They the wide variety of plants and animals that we have on this planet are all because of random mutations. That's just how it happens. And I'll get into it here in a second. That's why I'm kind of stuttering. Okay, so the next type of evolution is migration. Now remember, you are in control of this video, so if I'm going too fast, you're welcome to stop yourself at any time. All right, so migration is a movement of individuals into, which is, you remember from our previous notes, immigration, or out of, which is emigration, a population. This can change the overall gene pool of a population. This is also called gene flow. So if you look at the little illustration down there of the type of beetle where you have a green variety and a brown variety, if one of the brown variety goes into the green variety, now they have those brown variety genes that can then be expressed in their population. We see this in humans with different eye colors. There are some places of the world where there is only one type of eye color because the population has been so isolated for so long. And then when other populations come in, that's when you see a wider variety of eye color. All right, so a third type of evolution is called genetic drift. This is also a accident-based version of evolution, and this is just where you have a catastrophe. This is how mammals like you and I ended up being top of the food chain, because a catastrophe caused dinosaurs to go extinct. If dinosaurs hadn't gone extinct, we would not have the civilization that we have today. Dinosaurs would still be the dominant form of organism on the planet. So this is a change in the gene pool that happens by chance. Now, how is this different from mutations? Mutations generally happen to individuals, and then over time they get fixed in a population. Here you have just basically a whole bunch of organisms end up dying, and if you notice, like here you have green ones and brown ones, and most of the green ones get killed, so it ends up that then the new population is mostly the little brown beetles. So genetic drift is largely based on chance. And then you have natural selection. This is the most common form of evolution. It's the process by which traits that improve an organism's chance for survival and reproduction are passed on more frequently to future generations than those that do not. So in other words, organisms that happen to have a beneficial mutation, which is the first one, end up being more likely to survive and able to reproduce. So then it just so happens that the successive generations, the babies and the grandbabies that come after that, are all coming from that very successful individual. Now the individual has that change in a trait, in an adaptation, but the change to the overall population, that happens over time. So this is key here. The favorable traits must exist before the new environmental pressures begin. So in other words, if our world ended up being suddenly covered in water, humans are not going to grow gills because we don't have gills now. Miss, what happens if there's a change and you don't have a pre-adaptation like that? Like it doesn't exist ahead of time? Well, you die. That's what happened to the dinosaurs. They did not have a pre-adaptation for the change in the weather, and so they all died out. Well, some other things happened, but that was one of them. You may be familiar with the fact that Charles Darwin is the person who was famous for natural selection, but there's actually an independent guy in a completely different place whose name is Alfred Russel Wallace, who also developed the same theory. The only reason Charles Darwin ended up with all of the fame is, well, first of all, he did more experiments. He traveled the world to find evidence that his theory was correct, and then also he published first. His book came out first, and so people knew him first. All right, so here is a picture of evolution. This is not a catastrophe. This is, birds eat all the time, and so what ends up happening is they're able to focus. Let me back up. You've got green beetles and you've got brown beetles, and so the green beetles are more easy to spot for this bird, and so these get eaten up, which means the brown beetles are the ones that survive to have babies. So you can see eventually the population starts to shift towards these brown beetles. Now, what I would do if I were you is I wouldn't just be taking notes from these slides. I would also be kind of jotting down some of the interesting things that you're hearing, because these could be things that pop up on a test. Okay, this is called a case study, and what a case study is, I won't test you on this, but I want to let you know what it is. A case study is a real world example of something that we talked about. So here you have the example of the peppered moth. So you probably want to take a few notes on this. So you can see there are two varieties. You have the black variety, and then you have what's called the peppered variety. It's kind of speckled, like over here. Well, yes. I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to draw my cursor over where it is, and so that moth is right there. Okay, so basically here's what happened with this. In the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Revolution was in the 1700s. What does that mean? That's when people started mass producing stuff in factories and producing a lot of air pollution, basically, while they were doing it. So before that, this is a tree, and trees used to have lichen on them. This is in England, by the way. And so because of the lichen on the tree, you can imagine that this light peppered moth did really well hiding. This guy, whenever a black moth happened to be born, he didn't do so hot. He's kind of like I'm out and exposed. This one would get eaten very regularly, meaning that the majority of the moths that survive to reproduce are going to be this lighter variety, this peppered variety. Well, during the Industrial Revolution, all that air pollution killed the lichen off. The lichen, we're going to talk about what an indicator species is a little bit later, but just to kind of tell you ahead of time, this lichen is very sensitive to air pollution. So once all of that air pollution was put out in the Industrial Revolution, the lichen died, and the trees became covered with what's called soot. That's the stuff that's left over when you burn something. And now, the tables have turned. It just so happens that this black moth was pre-adapted for that change. And the peppered moth is now the one out in the open. So it turns out that this moth population then shifted in color almost entirely to all of the population being black. So again, let me go over this. Peppered moths have two varieties, black and the speckled variety. This is a moth that existed in England. I won't test you on this specifically, but you need to understand what's going on. The change in the environment was that the lichen that they lived on died. That's Lichen. It died. So then the black moth was pre-adapted for the change and was the one that ended up being able to survive and reproduce. And so this population evolved from being a mostly light-colored moth to most of the population being a dark-colored moth. So that is evolution that we have actually been able to watch happen. Okay, so here is another section of this module. By the way, if you're wondering if this module is huge, it is. So do keep that in mind. Okay, Module 2, Conditions of Natural Selection. So there are, let me check here, 1, 2, 3, 4. There are four, I believe, 4 conditions for natural selection. So the first one is organisms have to produce more offspring than can survive. Okay. This is one of the conditions of natural selection in order for it to happen. So environmental pressures like predators and limited food resources ensure or make sure not all offspring will survive till adulthood. So natural selection is not going to happen unless you produce more babies than survive. It's one of the reasons why humans really haven't evolved in recent memory. It's because our ability to make sure virtually all of our offspring survive to adulthood is pretty good. So we don't have a lot of opportunities for a big shift in our population in terms of major changes. Okay, so go ahead and pause this here and get it down if you need to. All right, next slide. Here is an example. On the left is a clownfish, and you can see all of its little eggs here. And then here on the right hand side, this is a kind of fish called a cichlid, and a jeweled cichlid, I believe. You can see all of its babies. So fish definitely meet that first criteria for natural selection. They have way more babies than make it to adulthood. Most of these are going to get eaten. That's kind of what they're for. Okay, so characteristic or condition number 2, individuals of a species vary in their characteristics. If you have a species where everything is almost all uniform, there's not going to be any change because there's no change to be made. So here you have a rock pocket mouse. These live in pockets of rock, around volcanoes. And you can see there are 2 varieties, the light variety and the dark variety. So you can imagine in areas where there's light colored rock, you're going to find that most of the population is light in color, and that in areas where there is dark colored rock, the dark colored mice do much better. If there is ever a situation where one of these 2 types of environments disappeared, then you would only have one of these varieties of organisms would survive moving forward. So again, you need to have varying characteristics in order for evolution to take place. If you don't have those varying characteristics, then if there is a change in the environment, the entire species can go extinct. Okay, so again, remember you can stop this video at any time. Individuals vary in their fitness. Fitness does not mean strength. It means being suited to your environment. A butterfly is very fit for its environment. You don't think of it as being strong, but it suits its environment perfectly. So again, that fitness is an organism's reproductive success. Do they fit into their environment so well that they're able to reproduce and have babies for the next generation? And then what is it, again, that makes these organisms fit and able to be reproductively successful? It's adaptations. Adaptations are heritable traits or a heritable trait that increases an individual's fitness. Okay, the key there is heritable. That means that you can pass it on to your baby. Maybe you have this butterfly that like has this super ability to create a toxin it can shoot out of its antenna. That's great. But if it can't pass it on to its babies, if it's just kind of a weird genetic mutation just in that organism, it's not going to do the population any good, and there's nothing to say that that butterfly's babies are going to be more successful in the future. So it has to be some sort of mutation, some sort of trait that's first of all beneficial and increases the fitness, and then it's something you can pass down to your babies. Okay, so here is an example of a heritable trait. You can see all of these different colors of fish. And again, you can see that the one that's probably going to do the best with survival is the green guy, probably followed by the blue guy. The yellow fish is probably going to end up getting picked off here almost immediately, which means that eventually this school of fish won't have any yellow fish in it in great grand fish baby populations. You're not going to see any yellowfish because they all get eaten and can't reproduce. Okay, so this is the last criteria or the last condition for natural selection, and that's survival of the fittest. Again, fit does not mean strong. Environments can change, which also changes the criteria for fitness. We talked about that with the rock pocket mouse and peppered moth examples. Why should you care? Just because an organism has evolved and suits its environment perfectly, evolution is not a goal that you can attain. It is something that continues to happen. Environments change all the time, and if your organism, if you as an organism do not have a trait already in place that will help you do better in the next environment that happens, then you die off. That's kind of how species go extinct. Again, remember that organisms do not evolve in response to a change. They must be pre-adapted to the change or they go extinct. Super simple. So here you go. This is a little cartoon of some dinosaurs. They're laughing at a mammal. Mammals were had barely evolved during the era of the dinosaurs, and then it started getting cold, and guess what? These guys did not have a trait in them that allowed them to survive the cooler temperatures. Mammals did. These guys died. These guys moved on and are still with us today. Okay, so our biggest way of knowing that evolution is real is through artificial selection. And this is basically evolution conducted under human direction. Our entire agricultural system is based on artificial selection. Makes crops larger, better tasting, more fruitful, and more diverse. This is also how we've ended up with the number of species of dogs that we have. They all came from wolves. We just, in order to get little tiny dogs that fit in your purse, you have to take the smallest dogs in one generation and then breed them together for the next generation. Keep going and going and going until you get the little tiny guys. So you basically force evolution to go in the way that you want it to. Here's an example. The wild mustard plant through through artificial selection, through humans choosing which plants get to reproduce and which ones don't, produced all of these different types of vegetables. Kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and cauliflower all came from this wild mustard plant. Kind of cool. Here's another example. We have paintings from the 1700s of watermelon, and they all look like this. Well, now watermelon look like this. Not only have we increased the fleshy pockets until it's one giant fleshy pocket, we also were able to cut down on the number of seeds that were there. Now, realize this was not us wishing this to happen. The only way that this occurred was every year a farmer would take the watermelons with the biggest pink fleshy pockets in them and then only use those to grow the year after. So then eventually you ended up with this. If a type of watermelon did not have a bigger fleshy pocket than this, this is what watermelon would continue to look like. So artificial selection only works with the genetic material you have. You cannot just go, oh, I'd like for this to have fins. Well, you don't have that to work with, so you don't get to have that. Okay, so allopatric speciation. So we've been talking about a bunch of stuff, but we haven't really talked about how, we've talked about how a species can change over time, but we haven't talked about how species form in the first place. So it happens through allopatric speciation. So you have one species, okay, and they're in populations. We talked about this, and something happens that separates the two populations. You could have some sort of connecting ice sheet has melted, sea levels rise and cut the two populations off of each other, a river changes course, there's a landslide, something separates the two populations. And then, down the line, random different mutations appear in the two populations. Like, this population over here has a random mutation where now they have red eyes, and then over here, or let's say red fur, and then over here they have like green fur. The mutations become fixed over time if natural selection says that that's a good idea. Like this one population lives in an area where there's red rock, and then this one over here lives in the green forest. So over time, the entire population has that mutation, and to the point that eventually they are far enough apart in the way that their genetics are made up that they cannot produce fertile offspring. Now remember, they can possibly still mate, they can possibly sometimes produce an offspring, like lions and tigers breed together and make a liger, but ligers can't have their own babies. So what that tells you is that lions and tigers are closely related, but not so closely related that they are the same species anymore. So then two new species have formed. So let me say that again. You have populations. All of the squirrels in the world don't live in one giant cluster. They're in little populations all over the United States. So let's say somehow a squirrel population gets isolated in the mountains. It gets up in the mountains, there's a landslide, it gets trapped. And the landslide blocks its way of getting back. So some random mutation pops up where maybe they have larger teeth. One organism has larger teeth. And it turns out those are good because the kind of nuts that they have around are big. So then that squirrel ends up reproducing because natural selection says that it's going to end up being the fittest one. It survives. And then eventually it's a whole new big tooth squirrel species. So that's how that happens. And again, ultimately, how do these physical barriers happen? Random chance. The reason that we have all of the different types of plants and animals we have on this planet is it's random chance. So here's an example. You have one bug population. It gets split in half by some sort of barrier. A random mutation up here for green pops up. It ends up being a good mutation that helps that organism survive. So then eventually you have two new species, the green beetle and the brown beetle, when they both had common ancestors. We've seen this happen in the Galapagos Islands. You may notice that this is an example of island biogeography. So here's Ecuador. These are all islands off the coast of Ecuador, and it turns out that although they have these individual different types of birds, they all came from this one species here on the mainland. So they ended up dispersing across all of these islands, and then because islands are pretty much trapped away from each other, they all developed into their own new species. So this is something you should probably write down. Islands end up with a lot of unique species because of evolution, because of allopatric speciation. So again, let me say that again. Islands end up with a lot of unique species because of allopatric speciation. So it's one of the reasons why you go to a place like Australia or Hawaii and they have things that you don't see anywhere else. It's because stuff got there, got trapped, and ended up becoming a new species. All right, so we've talked about all the good stuff, which is species developing. Now we need to talk about extinction. It's a complete disappearance of a species from Earth. There have been, and you need to know this number, 5 major worldwide extinctions on Earth, during which time we lost most of the world's organisms. Now, how is it that we have all of these organisms now? Well, if 90% of the world's organisms go extinct, the other ones aren't just going to sit around and go, oh gosh. They will spread out in where they live, and allopatric speciation will take place, and then you'll have new species develop. You need to know this particular one. The most recent extinction is called the KT event, and that's a Cretaceous Tertiary extinction, and you need to know that took place 65 million years ago. That's when the majority of the organisms on the planet were dinosaurs, all died out, and then mammals kind of took their place. So again, the KT event is the most recent worldwide extinction, and it took place 65 million years ago. Do realize that extinction is not a bad thing, it's just a thing. And so there's a thing called background extinction, that's the normal loss of species. When things change, species that do not have those pre-adaptations go extinct. They are no longer good for that environment. It's a lot like when the iPhone changed its charging cord and the old charging cord went extinct because it was no longer needed. You can't find them anymore. Okay, so, however, do realize that humans have made extinction go faster. All of these animals that you see on this page are animals that humans killed and killed and killed until they no longer existed. Dodos used to live on a island off the coast of Africa. They did not recognize humans as being a problem, so you could literally go up to them and club them to death. They're a little bit larger than a chicken, very tasty, so people basically ate them faster than they could reproduce, and then they were gone. Passenger pigeons were the same way. There are some estimates that there may have been close to 1 billion with a B of these birds in North America, and we managed to kill all of them off by the mid-1800s because they were larger than a normal pigeon, they were good food, and then also their feathers were used to like stuff pillows, and their bones were used to be ground up for fertilizer. I'm not familiar with the mamo bird, but I am familiar with the Tasmanian wolf. This is it's actually called a thylacine. It used to be found in Australia, and it's not a wolf at all. It is a marsupial. I would like for you to imagine this thing running around with a little cub in its pouch. So it had a pouch, and that's where it kept its young. We killed the last one off in the early 1940s. So do realize that although, again, background extinction is normal, humans are driving extinction of species now, and kind of leaving a hole in food webs and ecosystems. So that is the end of our presentation. Have a great day.